idealism, the idealism of Platonic forms, but even more pertinently, the rejection of a Kantian kind of conception of pure reason. Uh, Materialism uh, is what is the ground of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, right? Um, Nietzsche is searching for an historical explanation for the origin of our ideas of the good and the true, and he finds it in a material history of punishment, of oppression, and of the relation between oppressed and oppressors. A historical material, um, or rather a material history that leads to the invention of this ideal realm in which the good and true become these ideal forms, right? So Nietzsche is a materialist doing a materialist analysis of the ideas of the good in order to critique them. And Marx is going to do something very similar, giving a material history of, political economy to show where economic inequality comes from, and to give a kind of alternative interpretation of history, economy, and philosophy itself. So Marx is often called a historical materialist. And this is basically to say that he believes that our present conditions are the consequence of historical events. Now, there are historical idealists, people like Hegel, and we would even, I think, include Kant in that, who believe that history unfolds according to pure reason or a divine mind or certain absolute ideas, right? And historical materialism is going to reject this idea, saying that it's not that history follows some pure idea, but instead that material conditions, material circumstances have led to history being played out in the particular way that it has. Marx, interestingly, does not disagree with Kant, or more specifically Hegel, who we didn't read, but doesn't disagree with the idea that there is some kind of teleology to history. But that teleology, Marx thinks, is realized not as the material world comes to correspond and conform more and more with an ideal, but that teleology is realized as material circumstances themselves shake out. And they are bound, these material circumstances, to shake out in a certain way. Marx thinks that material history, the teleology of history, interpreted as materialist, leads us to communism. And I think it's interesting. I think it's very interesting, especially in light of what we just said about the idea that Kant is part of this Western political tradition, it's interesting to think about the continuation of a Kantian idea of the end of history, a Hegelian idea of the end of history, um, both of whom think that history does have some natural telos or end goal, uh, and that Marx picks up this idea essentially whole cloth but reinterprets it, turns it on its head, reverses it, says it's not ideas that are the engine of historical progress, it is material circumstances themselves. So Marx is very much within the tradition and continuing the tradition, however, reversing it by laying out this idea of an historical teleology that's going to end with communism. And in our next lectures, we'll look at why Marx thinks communism is the inevitable end to material history. Right. Now, one of the essential questions in thinking about history in terms of morality and connectedly then the economy is in asking this question about the origin of inequality. And there's an extremely influential and important, interesting essay that I would have loved to have included in the syllabus here by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another 19th century political philosopher. If you're interested in the origins of economic inequality, if you're interested in the origins of private property, which is a concept we'll talk about in the next several videos, if you're interested in the conditions that lead to modernity and the modern state, I strongly recommend reading it. The essay by Jean-Jacques Rousseau is Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. It's not a difficult read, but it is a very succinct articulation of some of the ideas that we see in Marx. I'm always struck by writing some 50 or 60 years before Marx. Rousseau has many of the same ideas. And so what put me onto this tangent about Rousseau is this essential question: what is the origin of inequality? And if we defer to a Nietzschean interpretation, we'd say that original inequality, the original separation between oppressed and oppressor, is due to a natural disparity in power. That the powerful, the strong, come naturally to dominate over the less strong or the weak. Right? So the nobles take power over everyone else and impose their values through ruthless punishment and exertion of power. Right now, we're leaving Nietzsche behind, but so this is Nietzsche's interpretation for the origin of inequality. For Marx, it's a different story, and his story is much more like the one that Rousseau tells in this other essay, Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which is that the original inequality is not due to a natural difference between one person or another in terms of strength or power, but is due to an original theft, that the rise of class, the distinction between the noble and the peasant, the noble and the plebeian, the oppressor and the oppressed, is originally brought about through the seizure of private property. Now I'm sort of cribbing from Rousseau and schematizing Rousseau and Marx here. But the thought is essentially that some people claimed natural resources that by nature belonged equally to all people as their own. Right? Land is not by nature given to an individual. It is given to all people equally, and the way that people originally gained power over others was by declaring private control over land and resources. Right? So, if there's a lake in your village and everyone drinks out of that lake, the lake is communally owned. It's a communal resource. Right? But then someday, someone comes in and says, in fact, I own this lake privately, and I've set up guards around the lake, and anyone who tries to drink from the lake has to pay me a fee to get water from the lake. Right? That is the privatization of what had been a communal resource. That is the original seizure of private property. And this, both Rousseau and Marx consider a kind of theft. So it's not a natural power that leads to this original inequality. It's an original injustice. Right? So whereas Nietzsche does not begin with an idea of justice, Marx does begin with an idea of justice. Okay. Now, one of Arendt's critiques of Marx, and I think it's useful to mention these because we'll be doing Marx in a minute, and I think it's good to maybe go into Marx with some informed critiques, right? And here I'm reading from page 19 of the document, which is linked on the syllabus.